Hi folks, I'm sorry not able to be in there with you again today. I'm planning to be in with you on Monday again, hopefully a little bit more mobile. And for today, most of what I want to do is clarify a little bit about the Oosterverr and Sonnenfeld reading from Monday, and I'll talk just a little bit about some related ideas. And most of what I want you to do in your discussion is to make sense of the ideas in Roberts. I think the Roberts chapters are much more easy to read, easy to make sense of. So I'll be having you use those in your discussion along with the lecture from last time on Niger, as well as a little bit from this lecture. But like I said, this lecture is mostly to help you make some sense of the Oosterverr and Sonnenfeld, but also I'm going to bring in a little bit of discussion of the national organic standards, so you have a little bit of an idea of what those look like. Okay, so first off, one of the ideas that is the key to the whole book from Oosterverr and Sonnenfeld is globalization. And globalization is simply the idea that there's an increasingly strong relationship between different regions of the world in terms of trade of things. So there are more and more things moving around the world all of the time, being traded from place to place. And if you hear about it like that, you might think back to your high school or your college history class, world history kind of, and start recognizing that, okay, when we talked about Marco Polo going to China way back in the 15th century, Marco Polo was bringing things back from China, and the colonial powers in Europe, Britain, Spain, France, they were starting to move goods around the world a lot all the way back in the 15th and 16th centuries too. So if globalization is an idea of something that's new, how is it different? And one of the big ways in which our contemporary idea of globalization is different from just these things starting to move more and more around the world is first, just volume. So we have a lot more things moving around the world than we did at that period, a lot more trade of goods. And part of that is because a lot more of us are buying more and more consumer goods, more electronics, more cars, more kitchen goods, more kitchen appliances. A lot more of us have TVs than back 30 years ago, for example. People used to mostly have a TV in the living room, and now sometimes people have TVs everywhere, or everybody has a screen at least that they're using. So having more and more of those consumer goods moving around the world is part of what has changed, but that's sort of just a change in volume. The really big change that we've seen during the past 30 years or so is the rise of transnational corporations as having a lot more power than national governments. So as we get great big corporations from the agrochemical companies like those that Monsanto and Bayer and Cargill are all part of, those are all great big corporations. Monsanto is actually part of another corporation these days. And those entities, those corporations, are starting to have a lot more power in our economic systems and in our governance systems than our national governments do in some ways. However, that doesn't mean that international systems of rules aren't still maintaining some regulation over these things. And some of those international systems of rules are actually based in national governments, or in the case of the European Union, in a transnational government. Or international governments, we might say. So one of those international systems of rules then is the European Union organics rules. And those influence a lot of the way things are grown, for example, in Central America, in the Caribbean, in South America. So together, the transnational corporations and the international systems of rules, like the European Union organics rules, are influencing a lot of the way the current food system works around the world, sometimes more than the way national governments alone are influencing them. But in order to understand a little bit about how these sorts of rules are affecting things around the world, let's take a little bit of a look at the U.S. National Organic Program rules. Okay, so these are some of the rules that the organic program lays out. So we talked before a little bit about plant diversity. One of the ways that transnational corporations have been building in more plant diversity is by having genetically modified organisms. But what that oftentimes means is that scientists in a lab are withdrawing genes from one kind of plant or animal and putting those genes from that plant or animal into a different plant, most of the time into a plant, rather than having plants breed together the way that plants naturally do. So crossing their pollen and their eggs with one another, they're actually having new genes inserted into them. Well, that process of taking genes from one plant or animal that's not related to a plant and inserting them into a new plant is called genetically modifying an organism. And genetically modified organisms are not allowed under the organic rules. So what that means is that if you are selling something as organic in the US, whether you're producing it in Honduras, if you're producing it in Chile, if you're producing it in Kenya, if it is certified organic, then it cannot have a genetically modified organism in it, regardless of which country it's coming from. So you can see there's this international spread of rules that affects what can happen here in the United States, but also affects the way things are grown in other countries. And in order to make all of that happen, to ensure that things that are certified organic really are following these rules, there are certifying agencies. So for example, there's a Florida certifying agency that it's not a state agency, but rather a private company, and they actually go out and certify farms in Florida and around the country, but also in places like the Dominican Republic. They fly out to farms and they look at what the farmers are doing, they review their practices, and periodically the farmer has to show, this is how I'm meeting the USDA organic standards. So there's actually somebody checking on them regularly, which is a lot different from what happens on conventional farms, although they have some other food safety practices they often have to follow as of the past few years. But leaving that aside, a few of the rules they have to follow. Ionizing radiation and sewage sludge are prohibited. So those sound like things you don't want in your crops perhaps anyway, sewage sludge in particular. But sewage sludge, for example, has a whole lot of great nutrients in it. It's just that it also sometimes tends to have, even if it's treated for pathogens, it may still have heavy metals in it. So that's part of why it hasn't been allowed in the national organic standards. If you are raising crops to be organic, those crops must be on land that have not had any prohibited substances on them for 3 years before they're certified as organic. So it's this big investment of time for the farmer. They have to spend 3 years where they're not certified organic. They're not getting a price premium for growing organic food, but they are still growing without all of the chemicals that can be really helpful. Okay, so instead, farmers should mostly be controlling their weeds and their pests through mechanical and biological means. So we've talked about this a little. So instead of spraying Roundup, for example, you're going to go in with a big cultivator, like what we saw with Earthrise Farms. So with Earthrise Farms, for example, they're taking a big cultivator that goes between the rows and cleaning up the weeds. Or one of the farmers I know who grows cotton, for example, he hires crews of people with hoes, and those people go out with their hoes and dig up all the weeds by hand. So there's a real focus on trying not to use chemical means of pest control, whether those pests are weeds or whether they're insects or whether they're fungus. So all of these things preferably should be controlled with mechanical and biological means. But sometimes even organic farmers need to have some kind of chemical control. They need to spray something to get rid of a really persistent insect pest or something along those lines. So when they need to do that, most synthetic substances are prohibited. Now, when we're talking synthetic, that means something that is created by humans instead of something that occurs naturally in nature without any human production. So the natural substances, they may be extracted from something, but they can't be produced in a lab, so to speak. There are a few things that are allowed by certifying agencies that are synthetic. So for example, for a long time, plastic ground cover has been allowed to help keep weeds down in a lot of organic systems. So farmers lay down a sheet of plastic and then they poke holes and plant the plants in those holes. And that way the weeds can't grow up around the plants that the farmers are trying to keep healthy. That plastic is made from petroleum. So it is a synthetic substance that's created from oil. And so that has been allowed. But most synthetic substances have not been allowed. And that includes a lot of pesticides, a lot of fertilizers. And so, for example, most of the nitrogen-based fertilizers and phosphorus-based fertilizers and so forth that are created in factories are not allowed. They instead have to be substances that are, dug up out of the ground, that are caught out of the ocean. Some have to be natural. So if all of those things have to be followed, like I said before, it doesn't matter if you're a farmer in the United States, or if you're a farmer in France, or if you're a farmer in China. If you are selling something to the United States that is supposedly organic certified, it has to follow those rules. So you can see how, even though we're saying national governments sort of have less power than they did in the past, to some degree, these sorts of rules are international governance, in that they're preventing things from veering outside of a certain standard, even though they're being produced somewhere far away around the world. So even though the transnational corporations are having a lot of influence, we can see here that international rules for organic production can also have a big influence. Okay, now back to kind of the nitty-gritty of Oosterverr and Sonnenfeld. One of the things that Oosterverr and Sonnenfeld look at is different ways of understanding food systems. And the first one they talk about is political economy of food systems. Now, broadly speaking, political economy is this idea that power and money tend to kind of go hand in hand, and that those with the more power in the system tend to have more influence on the system. And so the example they use here, which is actually called world systems theory, although they don't go into this too much, but their idea that they present is that peripheral regions tend to export their raw materials to core regions, and then those peripheral regions tend to import back the processed goods. Now, when they're talking about peripheral and core, what they're essentially talking about is poor and rich countries. So peripheral regions, like countries like Niger, where there is not a lot of capital, not a lot of wealthy corporations, they grow things in the ground, or they mine things out of the ground, or they cut down their trees. All of those things then get exported to another country, a core country, a rich country. And in the rich country, those goods are processed, and then they're shipped back to be used both in the core countries, but also in the peripheral countries. And the reason that matters is, what do you think the profit is from selling raw cotton versus the profit from selling finished cloth? Well, it turns out that the profit from selling finished cloth is a little bit better than from raw cotton. Now, textile mills are not the greatest example of finished processed goods. A lot of processed goods are actually much more lucrative than the raw materials. So for example, if you think about mining raw bauxite, which is kind of the base of aluminum, you don't get a lot of money as a miner, for example, who is working in a bauxite mine. However, as a company that's selling aluminum cans, you can make a lot of money. So most of the time, if you're selling back the processed goods, the finished goods, you make a lot more money. And so that's why this world systems theory of peripheral and core regions tends to matter, because the poor country is selling a product that doesn't make them a lot of money, and they're buying a product that requires them to pay a lot of money. So it contributes, I should say, to keeping those countries poor if they're exporting raw materials and importing finished goods. So that's the main idea of world systems theory, is that the core and peripheral regions tend to stay core and peripheral unless something changes, because the poorer country, the peripheral country, does not have a lot of ways to make more money because they're always selling something that is a very low value good. And the example of this in West Africa, as I mentioned, is cotton, because cotton is grown and sold by a lot of West African farmers, but they don't tend to make much profit on it. And yet most West African countries buy a lot of finished textiles from other countries. And for example, Holland is really known for producing African-style textiles that are bought back in Africa in various countries. So that means that the African countries don't tend to be making a whole lot of profit off of the cotton that they're producing, but they're having to pay for the expensive cloth once it is produced. So it's a very kind of negative cycle for the West African countries. Excuse me. So globalization and political economy of food systems. This is one way of understanding the food systems as a whole. Okay, now another way that Oosterverr and Sonnenfeld present of understanding the international food system is food regimes. So they talk about how we've gone through these different food regimes. And if we go further back in history, which we're going to be doing next week, we can see that food regimes are actually changing even more starting from further in the past. But for now, let's just look at the past century and a half. And there was this food regime between 1870 and 1914. This is kind of the first official food regime under this understanding of food regimes. Because this is a period when there starts to be this shift from lots of small farmers producing food close to home and selling it to their neighbors or maybe a little further away. And instead, we start to have settler agriculture in colonies like the United States, like countries in South America, like countries in Africa. And those colonies are all of a sudden exporting lots and lots of cheap goods. So like I said, cotton is a good example. Bauxite is a good example. Other things that are grown in the ground and mined out of the ground. All of those things are being produced in colonies, and they're being sold back in what we now call the core countries, those richer countries. Or in that time, it was the empire or the imperial countries that were making the money. And so as they're making those core countries, those imperial countries are making lots of money off of their colonies, they're able to build up their wealth. But part of the way they're building up their wealth then is on the backs of people that live in those colonies. So the people in the colonies aren't making money by the barrel, so to speak, but the people in the core countries are making a lot of money off of what people in the colonies are growing or mining. At the same time, as things start to be more expensive in those imperial countries, the colonizer countries, some people in those colonizer countries are too poor to keep up with the way things are starting to cost in those countries. And there's also not always enough food in those countries, as it turns out, for those who are lower income. It's harder to buy. So a bunch of the labor from those colonizer countries starts to emigrate. So we see the Irish emigrating to the United States in the Great Potato Famine, as we've talked about before. We also see another set of my ancestors, for example, emigrating from countries like Norway and Sweden, because they are finding that they just can't make a living with this new setup where all these cheap goods are being imported from faraway countries. They can't sell their crops at enough of a profit in order to make a living. And so they start leaving their hard scrabble farms in Norway and Sweden and Ireland, all over Europe, and they start emigrating to places like the United States. And so Europe ends up more wealthy because it's gotten rid of these huge populations of people that it doesn't have to support anymore, these poor farmers. And at the same time, it's making lots of money off of the backs of farmers in colonial countries, from the Americas to Africa to the Asian countries that were colonized. Okay, so that's that first food regime from 1870 to 1914. And then from 1945 until about the 1980s, we get another big shift. And you guys have already read about that shift in the Michael Pollan chapter, where he talked about the fact that all of a sudden we have industrial fertilizer. and industrial pesticides. So those synthetic pesticides and fertilizers start to make agriculture boom and make food production even cheaper. And that combines with U.S. agricultural policy. So we talked about the fact that now, slowly from that period from about 45 until the 80s, we give less and less direct support to farmers in the form of ensuring that they can make a profit. And instead, we're just ensuring that they get paid for whatever they produce. So we're encouraging them to produce more and more and more cheaply. And so each part of what they produce is worth less and less and less over time. But we just pay them to make sure that they have enough left. Apologize for the whiny cat in the background. All right. And then, so we get increasing standardization of food. We get these big monocultures developing, and we get more and more tractors and other kinds of mechanization in the fields. So that's that period from 1945 until the 80s. And then the current regime, and this is not an uncontroversial idea, but some have claimed that we've moved into a regime of post-productivism. And part of that is related to what we've already talked about, where national boundaries stop to matter as much, and instead, those transnational corporations start to matter a lot more. But one of the ideas that Oosterverr and Sonnenfeld present, I would present differently, which is post-productivism. And the way post-productivism is most often understood is that farm policy changes start to make for less emphasis on just growing more and more food. So, in that 45 to 1980 period, there was the emphasis on more cheap food. And now in this period, they say there starts to be more emphasis on producing environmental services from farms. So instead of just producing a lot of food, we want to ensure that the farm helps to keep its water clean. So when water is soaking down through the fields or washing off into the streams, we don't want it full of pollutants like pesticides or like excess fertilizers. And that there's also starts to be an emphasis on keeping farms as effective animal habitats, for example. Now, the big argument against post-productivism is that, well, only some countries are actually putting an emphasis on that in their policies. So certainly there have been policies very much like that in the European Union, including in Great Britain. But the United States has not had policies that have very heavily favored that idea. There are some policies, we won't go into the details right now, but there are some policies that have moved that direction. But U.S. by and large, in its agricultural policy, still has a strong emphasis on just producing a lot of food. That hasn't really substantially changed, despite a lot of changes in the way that we're supporting farmers. Okay, so that's food regimes. Some of the other ways that Oosterverr and Sonnenfeld say we can understand the international food system, I'm just going to present these all together as a group. So first, they talk about global commodity chains. And that's just the idea that you're trying to understand where your food comes from by looking back through all the steps behind its production. So if I'm trying to find out about my bananas, I'm going back and I'm finding out who distributed them to the grocery store. So who does the grocery store buy from? And then who did that distributor buy from? And all the way back till I trace it back to where those bananas were produced on a farm by a farmer somewhere. So I'm trying to understand all the links in a chain from beginning to end of how my food got into the grocery store and into my grocery bag. Then actor network analysis, it's a similar idea, but then we start to make it more complicated. So rather than just a chain from beginning to end, we start to understand that all the parts of the food system fit together. That not only do I have to know, in order to understand my banana, I don't just need to know all the people that sold it all along the way to the grocery store. I also need to understand who sold pesticide to that farmer, who sold fertilizer to that farmer, who is collaborating with the distributor, who is the trucker that works for the distributor, how is the trucker affected by labor laws. So I'm starting to put in a lot more pieces of the puzzle to understand this complicated system, that I'm starting to understand it's not just a chain of food passing through one set of hands after another. Rather, there are a lot of other laws and institutions like the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, international controls about what can pass over borders. All those sorts of things start to become part of what we see when we do actor network analysis. And for example, part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture is an entity called APHIS, A-P-H-I-S. And APHIS helps to control things coming over the border. So they check agricultural food to ensure that it meets regulations. And mostly what they're looking for is trying to ensure that we don't get nasty agricultural pests coming into our country that will harm our crops. Okay, so actor network analysis, though, is looking at all the complex pieces and how they fit together in a network. Convention theory is very related to that. And in a way, I think of convention theory as being almost a subset of actor network analysis, but you have to bring them together, and we'll do that on our last step here. But first, convention theory is trying to understand all the rules that shape the food system. So convention theory would have us look at, again, some of these examples we've talked about. So what are the National Organic Program rules if I'm talking about an organic crop? What are the labor laws that affect the trucker? What are the labor laws that affect the farm worker? What are the rules that each grocery store has for how its produce should be presented? So convention theory looks at all those different sets of rules and laws to understand how those affect the food system. And then finally, global production networks are kind of an attempt to put all of these pieces together. So we're trying to understand everything as a network. How do all those pieces shape one another? How does the fertilizer plant affect the farmer? How do the laws affect the fertilizer plant? How wealthy the owner of the fertilizer plant is affect whether it will continue to produce what it is producing? When I start to put in that piece about wealth, then we're really starting to bring in the political economy piece that makes global production networks what they are. So now we're going from just looking at networks to looking at who in the network has a lot of power and has a lot of money, and how does that power and money shape what happens in the network. So global production networks, like I say, they're just putting all the pieces together, looking at all the actors within the network, but trying to understand where the power is and how that matters. Okay, so like I said, the Roberts I'm mostly going to have you look at through your discussion questions, because I think you guys can all do a great job at making sense of that yourselves. The Oosterverr Sonnenfeld, I know that chapter is a bit dense, and some of the other chapters should be a little bit more clear because we'll start to focus more on more concrete ideas as we go forward. All right, so make sure you make sense of the Roberts as you're working on your discussion questions. Make good use of that, as well as of my Niger lecture and some of the Oosterverr and Sonnenfeld. And I look forward to being with you guys in person again on Monday. Make sure to look out for announcements from me about your upcoming projects and assignments. All right, see you guys soon.